Well, as I've noted, that in this portion of 1 Timothy chapter 5, verses 7, 8, 9, and even before that, Paul has been talking about the role of widows and the responsibility the church has to the widows and the responsibility the widows have to their families and the church and so forth. And he, in verse 9, brings up an interesting concept, or he makes a statement about something. He says, "Now, no widow may be put on the widow's list, or the list of widows, unless she is over 60, has been faithful to her husband, and is well known for her good deeds." And then he lists those good deeds, such as bringing up children, showing hospitality, washing the feet of the saints, helping those in trouble, and devoting herself to all kinds of good deeds. Well, Paul is saying an awful lot here, and I'll try to kind of break this down a bit so that we can understand what he's even talking about. And the very first thing when he talks about the putting widows on the list, this is a concept that is foreign to us, but keep in mind, there is no social welfare system in the ancient world. People who were indigent needed to have family members, and if they didn't have family members to care for them, then they were really often homeless and impoverished. So you realize that this was something that was a really, really common problem, that as we're dealing with homelessness today, an epidemic of it, and in our case it's due mainly to drug addiction, but in their time it was just simply the result of death and the loss of family members and the loss of financial support. And so widows were there, and one of the primary ways the church could show that they were loving people the way Christ loved them was to care for widows. And so there was a list. And this wasn't something that originated with the church. This was something that actually originated with the synagogue and within Judaism. In fact, we see in chapter 6 of the book of Acts, it begins the chapter by saying, "In those days when the number of disciples was increasing," this is the church in Jerusalem was growing, "the Grecian Jews," that is, Jews who came from Greek cities and Greek cultures, in other words, the rest of the Jewish world. They hadn't been born in Judea or Galilee. They had been born in places like Tarsus or Ephesus or whatever. And they had come and settled with their families there. He said the Grecian widows, they'd probably moved there with their families. Their husbands had passed away, and now they were alone. He said the Grecian Jews among them complained against the Hebraic Jews because, he said, their widows were being overlooked in the daily distribution of the food. Now, the Hebraic Jews would have been Jews who were born in Judea and whose family ties went for generations. They were part of a synagogue of believers who were also of Hebrew and Jewish origins within the land of Israel. And so they were simply being cared for and favored, and those who didn't have those historical connections were being overlooked. And so Peter speaks to the church, and he says basically the elders shouldn't give up their responsibilities of studying the word and being in prayer and go wait on tables. That's where the term deacon comes from, because deacons were basically people who were responsible to make sure that distribution was made to the widows on a weekly basis. So every Friday before the Sabbath, they would show up with money or food or goods that they would give to these women who were part of this list of widows that they were committed to taking care of. And so the early church simply followed that same pattern. They didn't create churches as distinct from synagogues. They simply created Christian synagogues, and they continued to operate in the same way synagogues had operated. And so here's this requirement, or this dynamic, where it isn't being done equitably. It isn't being done fairly. And so as a result, the apostles create this whole ministry, which later on became the idea that deacons are responsible for the financial and material affairs of the church, which is essentially, when we talk about people being on the board of a church, that's primarily a role of being a deacon. They're overseeing the financial, fiduciary, material aspects of the church. But basically, they made sure that this need was met and these people were being taken care of. Well, as Paul goes on, he says, when you think about making that list, and now this is being extended to Gentile churches, he says, make sure that there are certain requirements that are met. That first of all, that she has to be a woman who's over 60. And part of the idea is that she would be beyond the age of marriageability, because she would be beyond the age of childbearing. it's, again, we live in an age where many people are saying, well, I don't want to have children, and they see having family and children as a unnecessary burden that can be avoided. But in the ancient world, and even up until really recent times, the more children you had, the better off you were. And I think it's really interesting, because the more children you have, when you become elderly, the more family members you have to help support you and care for you in your latter years. And so he's basically saying, if there's a woman who isn't in that stage of life, and she'll probably want to remarry. In fact, he goes on later on to say that, and have children and so forth and so on. So therefore, make sure that they're really not looking to get married. They're not looking to have more children, but rather that they are really free from those responsibilities. And part of that is that first and foremost, he says, let's make sure that it's a woman who has been faithful to her husband, that she hasn't been literally an adulteress and hasn't cheated on him, but she has to be a woman who has lived in a faithful, committed, singular relationship, heterosexual relationship with her husband throughout the years in which he was alive. And then also he says that she has to be known for good deeds. And then he begins to really kind of lay those things out. What kind of good deeds is she supposed to be responsible for? And it's an interesting list. And again, I would say that it doesn't necessarily immediately translate into our culture, because our culture is obviously structured very differently. But first and foremost, that she has brung up children. That, in other words, that she has seen her children grow into maturity and into self-sufficiency. The reason why this is important is because it's probably the most important job in the world. The old adage says, the hand that rocks the cradle rules the world. And it's amazing. Guy Odom has written a book called Mothers, Leadership, and Success. And it's one of the most fascinating reads that I've ever read. I don't think it's available anymore. You might be able to find a copy if you're interested. But the bottom line is, this book really documents how that the role of mothers is so significant in creating all of the great leaders that we see throughout history. And it's really, as I read it, really opened my eyes to that tremendously powerful influence that moms have upon their children, not just simply to nurture and care for them, but really to help them begin to develop disciplines, things like hard work and study and so forth and so on. An overindulgent mother or a neglectful mother really robs their kids of the opportunity to realize what they potentially can be and could do. And a mother who is overly strict may produce kids that are really hardworking and disciplined, but they'll also carry kind of a resentment towards that hard work and discipline and their mothers. It's this balance in between where a mother is guiding gently by her hand, she's encouraging, but she's not making excuses or doing a kid's job for them. And this is one of the problems we have today, that most kids growing up today in our culture either have absent parents who just let the iPad raise their kids, or else they are just simply overindulgent. We call them helicopter parents, who don't want their kids to ever have to go through any bad experiences or difficulties. So if a kid has a problem at school, gets in a fight with another kid, they immediately want to fly down to the school and hold the school responsible. And I just hate to say it, I never like to see my kids go through hardship, but part of growing up is learning how to manage difficult situations. I get it. If there's going to be physical danger and harm, obviously you need to step in. But at the same time, we need to help our kids learn how to work through some things and not be overprotective. And the kids who often get bullied are the kids who have been overprotected. They don't know how to defend themselves. One of the benefits of growing up with siblings, especially a group of kids, is that they all learn how to fend for themselves. They learn how to survive. And you may not like watching your kids bicker and fight and do all the kinds of things they do, but there is a certain value that they derive from going through that. And so this is really the most important job in the world, is raising up kids. The future of the nation, the future of Christianity, really oftentimes comes down to how our kids do. Well, kind of run out of time, but I would just simply say in conclusion that not only is raising our kids the most important thing we do, but also it's the thing that has the most immediate and sometimes difficult consequences. But we'll pick this up tomorrow. God bless and go in His grace.